Good morning. I hope everyone's having a good day. We are running through something a little bit different for a Friday. It's a kind of my overview of some ideas from a book by Alan Jacobs entitled How to Think. And because I've talked a lot about critical writing and critical reading, and I think both of those tie with thinking, it seemed to me that I just wanted to give some of the key details of this book. Quick reminder that Melissa, Morgan, Brady, and Josh, I hope, are in the classroom today. And we're doing Writing Lab C. We will be going over the paragraph uh, of the book review. I will try to get to work on every paragraph that has been turned in and get them done over the weekend so that you have Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday to work through my comments as you work on the final book review for Ordinary Grace, which, as you can see here, is due April 21st at 11:59 p.m. Remember Monday, the quiz over Ordinary Grace. Remember that the Trail of Lightning paper is going to, or Trail of Lightning will be the next book. I hope to introduce the Trail of Lightning paper by Monday. And then we're just going to go through Trail of Lightning. I'm going to be doing quite a bit of background information on that one at the start, where we probably aren't going into the plot very much. And then remember Friday, Writing Lab D. And part of Writing Lab D will just again be going over the book review that has been submitted and talking about what's good, what's bad, and how those papers can be made better as we get ready for the final paper. And one more thing, please remember basically there are three papers left: the book review, the in class paper that we're going to be working on with bits of Trail of Lightning, and then we will also be doing the Trail of Lightning final paper. The how to think I want to tie to the mission of the English department is to develop graduates who think creatively and critically and who communicate well by providing instruction in composition, literary analysis, and creative writing. It's supposed to be to English majors, English minors, and students in general education classes. Comp counts as one of those general education classes. The book is How to Think, a survival guide for a world at odds. The idea that people are full of conflict right now, I think, is part of Dr. Jacobs' thinking. He's a professor of humanities in the honors program at Baylor University. How to Think, the Year of Our Lord, 1943, talking about people in Great Britain dealing with the effects of the war and how to think about planning for the future after the war. Breaking Bread with the Dead was a book about how to deal with books from the past that don't share the sensibilities of the 21st century, and how to negotiate with the past, I think would be the term. Jacobs defines thinking as not the decision itself, but what goes into the decision: the consideration, the assessment, the weighing of the available evidence, grasping what is, and speculating about what might be. And Jacobs, I think, makes a big deal about thinking is not always individual. In fact, he would argue that thinking is communal, and we'll have a full slide on that, and that might even be the next one. It's not. But he talks about the fact that people want to avoid thinking. It troubles us, it tires us, it forces us out of the familiar. If we're actually thinking, we're forced out of the familiar. And it sets us as odds and complicates the relationships with those we admire or those we follow on the interwebs. Thinking is something that a lot of times we don't want to do because it's a lot of work. And because we are social creatures, and if we think or think too much, we sometimes fall out of favor with people that we like. And it's not a new phenomenon. T.S. Eliot wrote a long time ago, when everyone knows a little about a great many things, it becomes increasingly difficult for anyone to know whether he knows what he's talking about. And I think it's important to understand that we live in an era where it's super easy. It's easier than it was for T.S. Eliot to know a little about a great many things. The other thing I think that's important here is that thinking, for better or for worse, has been, I think, relegated to stereotypes. I like Star Trek. Spock was the thinker. He didn't have any emotions. Data was the thinker. He looked for emotions, but he didn't have very many. I think Jacobs tells us that being rational does not require the suppression of all feelings. And in fact, being rational, thinking involves the emotions as well as the intellect. And this is the slide I was talking about earlier. To think independently of other human beings is impossible. Thinking is necessarily thoroughly and wonderfully social. Everything you think is a response to what someone else has thought and said. I used the book last semester, Everything is an Argument, the idea that there's a response. I think the bottom sentence here is important too. When people commend someone for thinking for herself, they usually mean ceasing to sound like people I dislike and starting to sound more like people I approve of. The people we admire who think for themselves are people we agree with, and I think it's important to understand that thinking is always a group activity, and the best way to think is probably to have our foot in the camp of many different groups. It just makes it easier to think because we have more interaction. Jacobs talks about the idea that a lot of times we communicate by metaphor, and metaphor allows us to stop thinking. He believes that argument is a way of achieving mutual understanding. It is a way of communicating. It is the giving and sending of message. However, most of the time, argument is about, I won the argument. Argument is aligned with war. War is politics is war by other means. And I think it's important to understand that those metaphors get in the way of thinking because the term argument means war when it probably should mean mutual understanding or an attempt to achieve mutual understanding. And so, one of the first things to do with thinking is to try to get rid of thinking and speaking only in metaphor. He talks also, I think, about the fact that we sometimes don't always recognize the metaphors. And one of the steps to thinking again is this a metaphor? Is this a story that we have negotiated out of a string of metaphors, or composed out of a string of metaphors? And because we have composed it out of this string of metaphors, we cease to understand it. This is why earlier I said that if we're going to think, we should be around people we disagree with. They're the ones who are best able to puncture the metaphors. They're the ones who are best able to tear apart that string of thought. And we should do it to achieve mutual understanding, not to try to win the point by screaming and shouting a lot. I don't think Jacobs necessarily says it. This is Collis talking, but I think one of the things that prevents us from thinking is the idea that we have to be loud. And I think, and I'm using the term think in two different ways here, I apologize. I believe that we don't have to be loud to separate the metaphors, to kind of break apart the story that we want to be a part of. He concludes that in search of social belonging and the blessed shortcuts we can take when we're in the presence of like-minded people, we come to rely on key words and then metaphors and then myths. And at every stage, habits become more deeply ingrained in us, habits that inhibit our ability to think. And one of the things that reading the different books, Henrietta Lacks should have been a new experience to us. I think Trail of Lightning will be a new experience for us. I am pretty sure that going back to 1961 for a lot of you might have been a new experience. If it can break apart a keyword, if it can break apart a metaphor and keep us from developing the myths, perhaps it can make us think. Being comfortable, I believe, is one of the things that prevents us from thinking. If we can talk about the links to writing for just a bit. Remember that the definition is operational. It's not the decision itself, testing the responses, speculating carefully and responsibly about what might be, and knowing when not to go it alone and whom to ask for help. When you did the research paper, when you did the annotated bibliography, you were asking the experts for help. When you're doing the book review and when you're doing the next essay, you're going it alone. The book review is testing your response. The book review is going through and what goes into the decision. Why is it good? Why is it great? Why is it bad? Why is it ugly? Remember that the summary response was always about what goes into the decision. The research paper and the annotated bib was about the assessment and the weighing of the available evidence. The book review is speculating about what might be, what can be better. And remember, thinking and argument and writing are an attempt to achieve mutual understanding. It's a means of clarifying our views. That's the thinking element. That's the critical element of it. The critical writing is expressing those views well. It's going through the process. It's using things like radar and cups. It's doing things like the paramedic method to make the writing more clear. Jacobs does a checklist at the end of his book, and I think I just want to take a minute or two or three and just run through the checklist, because I think the checklist applies not just to class, but the checklist applies to everyday living. When you're angry, take 5 minutes and get your body involved. Don't sit and stew, take a walk. Do the dishes. Do something. You'll think better if you can separate yourself. Number 2, value learning over debate. And the learning over debate, I think, is the learning over winning. There was a cartoon a long time ago about an old guy and his wife is behind him saying, "Oh, why don't you come to bed?" And he says, "I can't. Somebody on the internet is wrong." Learning over debate. What new can we learn? Number 3, avoid people who fan the flames. People who like getting everybody riled up, people who like everybody angry. Avoid those folk. If you've got nothing new to add, you don't have to add anything. And you don't have to respond to show that you agree with the right folk. And number 4, if thinking is social and the people you're with demand that you signal your agreement, maybe it's closer to a cult than a friend group. Look for people who can value community. I mean, it's one of the goals of Mount Marty. And look to people who can disagree with equanimity. People who can disagree without being disagreeable. People who can disagree without screaming and shouting as their first response. And I think that this is kind of key because, again, thinking is social. Very, very few people have an original thought. Listen without responding. I was a debate coach for a long time. I had kids, I trained kids to sit and write down everything the other side said and think about responses. That, I think, is for the game of debate. In the real world, I think it's best to listen without responding, then ask some questions, then formulate the response, and then disagree, if necessary, without being disagreeable. The next one is assess your repugnances. If you look at the one below it, it says realize that the ick factor may be a distraction. So what makes you go ick? What are the social issues? What are the conversations? What are the situations that make you go ick? And are those a distraction from what really matters? Remember, one of the logical fallacies I talked about was the red herring. The red herring introduced something new into the argument. A lot of thinking right now is this central to the discussion, or is this something to take me down a new path? And a lot of the easiest way to take somebody down a new path is to toss out the what if ick factor. Don't let the metaphors, don't let the myths, don't let the little stories that you have composed about this is the world I live in keep you from thinking. The second to last one is, I think, super important. When you are trying to describe others' positions, use the language that they use. Don't try to put it into your own words. Try to understand their words and their language. It's one of the reasons that people use quotations in research papers, for example. But I think trying to describe others' positions in the language that they use is extremely important. Finally, be brave. Thinking is hard work. That requires bravery. Thinking means you might have to change your mind. That requires bravery. Thinking means that you're going to consider a lot of things that might make you go ick, but that ick is a distraction. But you're going to have to consider it first before you can determine whether it's a distraction. It requires a little bit of intellectual and bravery. Daily writing today is pretty simple. List the author and title of the book that's the basis of today's presentation in the comments. I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we'll see you guys in class next week.